Atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where everybody knows the quickest way to a man's heart is through a nice big platter of seal meat and whale blubber. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Last Radio. So good of you to join us tonight. And as you may already be aware, the matter of Greenland, specifically the territorial sovereignty of Greenland, more specifically the question of who shall be Greenland's colonial master, been a topic of much discussion and controversy in recent weeks, and much of that discussion and controversy, not surprisingly, has been overheated and hysterical to the point of being really quite funny. In fact, some hyperventilating Europeans and many hyperventilating Democrats have even taken to calling it the Greenland crisis. Is it actually a crisis? Not really. How do we know it's not a crisis? Because we're literate enough to understand history didn't begin 5 minutes ago. And we are circumspect enough to recognize that all events in the present day are a culmination of a long series of previous events that transpired in years and decades and centuries past. And so, in order to underscore and reinforce these concepts that we endeavor so often on this program to underscore and reinforce, and in service to the cause of public mental hygiene, tonight we present for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to the barren Arctic desert that those cheeky Vikings ironically named Greenland, including an appearance by our special guest star, the Monroe Doctrine. And without further ado, let's strap on our sealskin boots and saddle up our trusty polar bear and begin the expedition, shall we? Episode 1, 986 AD, the first Norse settlement. Greenland enters recorded history the way many places do, by accident, by exile, and with an aggressively dishonest marketing campaign. Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for killing people who were apparently insufficiently understanding about being killed, sailed west and found a vast frozen landmass that he promptly named Greenland. This was not irony, it was branding. Medieval branding, to be sure, but branding nonetheless. The Norse settlement of Greenland was not a colony in the modern sense, it was more of a gamble. A thin string of farmsteads clung to the southwestern coast, surviving on seal meat, walrus, ivory, and an almost heroic, some might say irrational, level of stubbornness. There was no state apparatus, no standing army, certainly no imperial bureaucracy. Governance, such as it was, consisted of assemblies, kinship ties, and the shared understanding that wind and snow and ice are the real sovereigns. And this is worth lingering on for just a moment because it reminds us that for most of human history, sovereignty was not about flags or treaties, it was more about presence. If you could live in a place, farm a few meager crops there, and manage not to die immediately, you could plausibly claim ownership of it. As such, Greenland was not owned so much as it was endured. The Norse didn't conquer Greenland, they survived it, at least until they didn't. Episode 2, 1262 AD. Greenland enters union with Norway. By the mid-13th century, the Greenland Norse did what frontier communities often do. They desperately appealed for help. Or, more precisely, they acknowledged the sovereignty of some distant king in some faraway land in exchange for the vague promise of protection, legitimacy, and trade. In 1262, Greenland formally entered into a union with the Kingdom of Norway, becoming, on paper at least, a constituent part of a medieval Scandinavian realm. This was less an act of imperial expansion than one of administrative housekeeping. Norway didn't suddenly garrison Greenland or make any meaningful investment in its development. The crown asserted sovereignty in the way that medieval states preferred, by writing it down and trusting that geography would take care of the rest. And geography in this case was a very persuasive mistress. The Norse settlements declined over the following centuries, battered by shifting climates, economic irrelevance, and competition from the Inuit, who were far better adapted to the environment, having lived in it since time immemorial. By the 15th century, the Norse were gone, not conquered, not overthrown, simply erased by entropy. What's remarkable is that Norway and later Denmark never relinquished their respective territorial claims. Greenland became a sovereign possession without subjects, a legal fiction floating over an empty ice sheet. It was conquest by paperwork, and it worked rather astoundingly well. Episode 3, 1721, Danish-Norwegian resettlement and colonization. Greenland re-enters the European consciousness in the 18th century, not because it suddenly mattered strategically, it very much didn't, but because Europe never entirely forgot how much it dislikes unfinished business. In 1721, the Danish-Norwegian crown sponsored a renewed settlement effort led by missionaries who believed, incorrectly but quite fervently, that the Norse colonists might just still be out there waiting to be Lutheranized. They weren't. turns out. What Denmark found instead were Inuit communities who had lived in Greenland continuously and successfully while Europe displaced the world's largest island for several centuries. This posed a bit of a mild philosophical inconvenience which colonial powers traditionally resolve by simply ignoring it. The new Danish presence was an explicitly colonial one this time, trading monopolies, missionary oversight, and very tight administrative control. Greenland was no longer a lost medieval outpost. It was a managed possession, still marginal, still remote, but now firmly slotted into the European system of empires that assumed land could be owned even when it steadfastly resisted habitation. From this point forward, Greenland's status would be defined less by who lived there and more by who claimed it. The ice stayed the same. The paperwork improved quite a bit. And that distinction between presence and possession is going to matter a great deal once the United States of America enter our story. Episode 4, 1814, the Treaty of Kiel and the Accidental Permanence of Denmark. Greenland's modern political status begins, as so many enduring arrangements do, as a clerical afterthought following decades of armed conflict. In 1814, Denmark found itself on the losing side of the Napoleonic Wars and was forced under the Treaty of Kiel to surrender Norway to the King of Sweden. This was supposed to be a clean divorce. In the actual event, it was not. Denmark, in a moment of legalistic nimbleness that would make future international lawyers politely golf clap in appreciation, managed to retain Norway's former overseas possessions, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. The rationale was thin, but the ink on the signatures dried anyway, and all of the wax seals were properly affixed, which in international law is what actually matters. Thus, Greenland became Danish not because Denmark had conquered it or settled it anew or even particularly wanted it, but because nobody else objected strongly enough at the negotiating table. Sovereignty here was not asserted with cannons or with colonists, but with a carefully worded footnote. When Edward Bulwer-Lytton famously posited that the pen is mightier than the sword, this is just the sort of thing he was talking about. And this moment is a crucial one because it fixes Greenland's status in the European order just 9 years before the United States would announce, loudly and with great self-confidence, that Europe was no longer welcome to rearrange the Western Hemisphere at its will. Timing, as it turns out, is everything. Episode 5, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine and America's Grand Declaration. In 1823, President James Monroe informed Europe politely, firmly, and with a confidence that was not entirely justified by the current state of American military power, that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonial business. The Monroe Doctrine was not a treaty. It was not even enforceable. It was, at the time, more of an aspiration than a policy, but it was also a warning shot. The doctrine rested on a simple premise. European political control in the Americas is inherently destabilizing and is therefore unacceptable. New colonies were out. Old ones were more complicated. The United States, still young and rather deeply insecure, was nonetheless staking a moral and strategic claim to hemispheric guardianship. Notably, Greenland was not mentioned. This was not an oversight, rather, it was a feature. Greenland sat awkwardly at the edge of geography and definition. North American in location, European in administration, and Arctic enough that nobody wanted to think very deeply about it. Thus, Denmark's claim slipped through the doctrinal net, grandfathered in only by inertia. The Monroe Doctrine, like all great declarations, drew bold lines and left the margins as fuzzy as possible. Greenland lived inside those margins, quietly Danish, while America directed its gaze instead to the south and the west, at least for now. Episode 6, 1867, Alaska and the Limits of American Patience. If Greenland represents the European talent for hanging on to territory by paperwork alone, Alaska represents the American allergy to leaving European powers anywhere nearby. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million, an act that was widely mocked at the time and almost universally praised in hindsight. This was not about whaling rights or seal pelts or even gold, really. It was about proximity. The idea of a European imperial power squatting indefinitely on the North American continent offended American strategic sensibilities in a way that could not be tolerated, even if the offender was broke, distant, and slowly collapsing. Had certain voices prevailed, voices counseling restraint, thrift, and minding our own business, Russia might well have retained a colonial foothold in North America well into the modern era. Monroe Doctrine, in that case, would have remained a polite suggestion rather than a lived reality. Alaska established a precedent. European possessions in the New World were acceptable only so long as they were temporary. The United States might tolerate them, but it would not forget them. And somewhere across the Arctic waters, Greenland quietly took note. Episode 7, 1898, the Spanish-American War, or When America Learned It Had Muscles. By the end of the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine had evolved from a diplomatic posture into something closer to a personality trait. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marks the moment when the United States stopped merely objecting to European imperialism in the Western Hemisphere and began physically dismantling it at gunpoint. Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in one efficient imperial liquidation sale. The message to Europe was unmistakable. Old empires were no longer protected by tradition or by age or by paperwork. If you had colonies in the American sphere, you had them on borrowed time. This mattered for Greenland not because Greenland was threatened, but because the rules of the game were changing. The United States was no longer a continental republic with regional interests. It was becoming a hemispheric superpower with strategic horizons. The doctrine was no longer about non-interference alone. It was about control of outcomes. And in that worldview, geography becomes destiny. The Arctic stops being a frozen wasteland and starts being a map of future transit routes, military positioning, and access corridors. Greenland's value begins to shift, not as land, not as a colony, but as a platform. Denmark still owned it, but like a buxom blonde in a bar on a Saturday night, America had started noticing it. Episode 8, 1914 to 18, World War I and the Strategic Awakening of the North. The First World War reconfigured strategic thinking everywhere, but it had a particular effect on how powers viewed geography. Oceans stopped being moats and started being highways. Distance stopped being protection and started being vulnerability. The Arctic world entered military consciousness not as a battlefield, but rather as infrastructure. Shipping lanes, communication routes, refueling points, and future air transit corridors became planning considerations. Greenland's location, once a liability, became its defining feature, a massive immobile aircraft carrier between North America and Europe, whether anyone admitted it yet or not. The United States emerges from World War I with industrial power, financial leverage, and global reach, but also with a new obsession: strategic depth. Security was no longer about borders, it was about buffer zones, access control, and forward positioning. Greenland, again, remained Danish on paper, but it had entered the American strategic imagination in a way that it never had before, not as a territory to govern, but as a terrain to control indirectly. The old European model of sovereignty, of flags, monarchs, charters, and so forth, was colliding with the new American model of logistics, access, and influence. Episode 9, 1941, World War II and the end of Greenland's innocence. World War II is the moment when Greenland stops being abstract and becomes operational. When the Germans occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland's legal status became suddenly profoundly weird. It was Danish territory governed by a government that no longer meaningfully governed itself. And let's face it, if the mother country can be conquered in under 48 hours by a couple of thousand men with parachutes, then its viability as a colonial administrator of huge faraway possessions has come very much into doubt. The United States responded pragmatically, but not necessarily legally. In 1941, America moved to protect Greenland on Denmark's behalf, establishing military bases and asserting de facto control over the island's defense. No conquest, no annexation, no declaration, just strategic necessity wrapped in legal fiction. This is the Monroe Doctrine in its mature form, not slogans, not speeches, not proclamations, but quiet occupation without formal ownership. From this point forward, Greenland becomes a functional part of American hemispheric security architecture. It is no longer European in any meaningful strategic sense, irrespective of whose flag flies over its capital. Denmark retains sovereignty, America retains control of outcomes, and the Arctic becomes part of the American defensive perimeter, not by law, but by logistics. Episode 10, 1947 to 1960, the Cold War and the Arctic as a tripwire. The end of the Second World War didn't bring peace so much as it brought planning. Specifically, planning for a war that everyone hoped would never happen, but which everyone assumed eventually would. Enter the Cold War, and with it, a grim new strategic logic. If nuclear annihilation was coming, it would come like a much angrier version of Santa Claus, namely, from the direction of the North Pole. Intercontinental bombers and later ICBMs didn't travel east to west along familiar maps. They went north. The shortest path between the Soviet Union and the United States ran straight across the Arctic, and Greenland sat squarely in the middle, like a very cold doormat. In this era, Greenland ceased to be merely useful, it became essential. Early warning radar systems, weather stations, and listening posts proliferated. The island became part of a continental nervous system designed to detect the first hint of Soviet aggression, not to stop it necessarily, but to give leaders a few extra minutes to decide how the world should end. The Monroe Doctrine was now fully militarized. No European power could meaningfully operate in the Arctic without American consent, and no adversary could pass through it unnoticed, at least not in theory. Greenland wasn't American territory, but it was unmistakably American space. Episode 11, 1951 to 68, Thule Air Base and the Nuclear Age Gets Real. If Greenland was the tripwire, Thule Air Base was the pressure plate. Established under a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark, Thule became one of the most important military installations on Earth, a hub for radar, air defense, and nuclear deterrence at the very edge of human habitability. This was not subtle imperialism. This was the enormous runways, nuclear-capable bombers, and a permanent American presence 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The local Inuit population was relocated to make way for it because strategic necessity has never enjoyed the luxury of sentiment. Then came 1968 when a US B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule, scattering radioactive debris across the ice. Denmark, which officially prohibited nuclear weapons on its territory, learned the hard way what shared defense actually means. Greenland's role was no longer theoretical, it was baked into nuclear reality. The island existed functionally to absorb risk on America's behalf, geographic insurance against catastrophe. Sovereignty remained Danish, control remained American. Consequences were shared unevenly. Episode 12, 1991. The Cold War ends and everybody forgets why Greenland matters. And then, miraculously, the Soviet Union collapses. The existential threat evaporates. Nuclear Armageddon is postponed indefinitely, and with it, strategic memory begins to fade. Bases are downsized, budgets are cut, Arctic infrastructure is maintained more out of habit than out of urgency. Greenland slips back into the background, filed away in a folder labeled Cold War Leftovers. This was not because Greenland became less important, but because America had briefly convinced itself that history was over. The Monroe Doctrine entered a kind of bureaucratic hibernation, if you will, not repealed, not rejected, just assumed to be unnecessary and surplus to requirements. Europe was friendly, Russia was reforming, China was opening up. Greenland became a place for climate studies, indigenous politics, and polite international cooperation. Strategy gave way to symposiums. Deterrence yielded to PowerPoint slides. And as always, the moment a power stops thinking strategically is the moment it starts being surprised. Which brings us, inevitably, to the present. Episode 13, 2007 to 14. Russia returns, China arrives, and the Arctic reopens. History, as it turns out, like the man in the Monty Python picture, wasn't quite dead yet. In 2007, the Russian Federation staged one of the most on-the-nose geopolitical stunts of the modern era by planting a titanium Russian flag on the seabed beneath the North Pole. This was not legally binding, of course, but it was very much on brand. The message was clear. The Arctic was back, and Russia intended to treat it the way Russia has always treated frontiers, as places to be claimed, fortified, and argued over loudly. About the same time, China began referring to itself with a straight face as a near-Arctic power. This is an interesting phrase, in the same way that calling oneself nearly pregnant is also interesting. China's interest was not subtle. Shipping lanes, undersea cables, rare earth minerals, and the long-term leverage that comes from being present before anybody thinks to stop you. Greenland once again found itself at the center of a map that people had stopped pretending didn't exist. The Monroe Doctrine, long thought to be dormant, began twitching in its sleep. Episode 14, 2015 to 2020. Changing climates, new shipping lanes, and the return of geographic reality. ice melts, geography reasserts itself. As Arctic ice receded, new shipping routes emerged. Routes that could cut weeks off of transit times between Asia, Europe, and North America. What had once been an impassable wasteland became an economic accelerant. At the same time, Greenland's mineral wealth, long thought to be inaccessible, suddenly mattered. Rare earth elements, uranium, oil, gas, and strategic metals turned theoretical interest into practical concern. Denmark, a country whose entire population could fit into a mid-sized American metro area, found itself nominally responsible for a landmass of enormous strategic value at the exact moment that great power competition returned. Greenland's own autonomy movement gained momentum, but autonomy cuts both ways. Independence requires protection, investment, and allies. And once again, the same unspoken assumption resurfaced that whatever Greenland technically was, it could not be allowed to fall under hostile influence. Climatic changes didn't create this problem. It merely removed the ice from the cover page. Episode 15, 2021 to the present day, the Greenland crisis, and why it isn't one. Which brings us to the so-called Greenland crisis. Pearl-clutching Europeans recoil at the suggestion that the United States might seek sovereignty, control, or exclusive strategic dominance over Greenland. In London and Paris and Brussels and elsewhere, this is framed as shocking, aggressive, even unprecedented behavior. In point of fact, it is none of those things. From the Monroe Doctrine forward, the American position has been simple. European powers do not get to project strategic power in the Western Hemisphere in ways that threaten U.S. security. Greenland is not an exception to this rule. It is merely a test case. The fact that Denmark's claim predates the Monroe Doctrine by 9 years does not negate it. It merely explains why the issue was deferred until conditions changed. And conditions have most assuredly changed. If Greenland matters, and it very much does, then someone will control it. The only real question is whether that someone is a distant European monarchy, a rising Eurasian bloc, or the continental power that already defends it in every practical and meaningful sense. This is not imperialism, it is geopolitics doing what it has always done. Greenland has never been isolated, it has only been quiet. From Norse settlers to Cold War bombers, from Danish colonial administrators to Arctic shipping consortiums, the island has always existed at the intersection of ambition and necessity. The Monroe Doctrine did not create this reality, it merely gave it a name. And now, as ice melts and history resumes, Greenland returns to its accustomed role, not as a peaceful periphery, but as a strategic fulcrum. Anyone who is shocked by this hasn't been paying attention. Anyone surprised by America's interest has forgotten its own history. And anyone calling this a crisis is mistaking inevitability for controversy. And with that, we put the bear in the barn, retire to our cozy igloo, stick our boots by the fire, and I convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we continue to persist in our stubborn belief that history did not begin last Tuesday and words still mean things. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Last Radius, and thanks ever so much for joining us tonight. Much like the topic of Greenland last week, tonight's subject is something suddenly spoken about with great urgency and great presumed authority by people who learned of its existence approximately 15 minutes ago, and in terms of historical circumspection, would be lucky to identify the difference between their ass and a hole in the ground. And so, tonight we present for your kind consideration, Curmudgeon's Field Guide to the Insurrection Act. This is one of those pieces of legislation that lives most of its life in quiet, blissful obscurity, much like a fire extinguisher behind some glass, rarely used, poorly understood, and suddenly the focus of intense attention when smoke appears somewhere in the building. And as is so often the case, the louder the panic, the thinner the understanding. The Insurrection Act is not new, it is not secret, and it is not a recent invention of whichever political faction currently alarms you the most. It is, instead, a blunt, awkward, historically contingent tool written by a young republic that deeply mistrusted centralized power, but mistrusted chaos even more. So tonight, in the continued interest of public mental hygiene, we will do what we always endeavor to do on this program: slow the tape down, widen the aperture, and look at what the Insurrection Act is, what it is not, how it has actually been used down through the centuries, why the current conversation about it is generating far more heat than light. So please securely fasten your safety harness and keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times. There will be no polar bears this week, but there will be militias, federal troops, constitutional anxiety, and at least one moment where history once again fails to cooperate with our modern hysteria. Episode 1, 1807. What problem the Insurrection Act was actually written to solve. The Insurrection Act of 1807 was not written in a moment of calm. Rather, it was written in a moment of something one might call nervous clarity. The United States was very young, very lightly populated, very poorly connected, and very deeply unsure whether it would long survive its own initial success. There was nothing resembling a federal police force or a standing internal security apparatus, and the nascent republic exercised only the loosest control over vast, newly acquired territories that existed more on maps than in reality. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the country almost overnight, and with it doubled the number of ways in which the whole experiment might well unravel. Enter our old friend Aaron Burr. That dude again? Yes, that dude again. Former vice president, professional scoundrel, and walking argument against strong assumptions about elite virtue. Mr. Burr spent the mid-1800s plotting to carve out his own personal empire somewhere in the Western Territories, possibly by detaching land from the United States, possibly by conquering parts of Spanish North America, possibly by egomania alone. And to be sure, he had no shortage of that. The details remain somewhat murky. The alarm, however, was not. What Burr represented was not merely treason, but plausible treason, a reminder that ambitious men with money and followers and guns could potentially exploit distance, weak institutions, and state-level hesitation to challenge federal authority outright, and to possibly succeed in doing so. The Insurrection Act was Congress's answer to that reality. It authorized the president, under specific conditions, to deploy federal military force when state authorities were unable or unwilling to enforce federal law, not to rule the country, but to keep it from flying apart. This was not a power grab, it was an admission. The founders did not trust standing armies. They trusted unchecked fragmentation even less. The act exists because the Republic understood early on that laws without enforcement are merely polite suggestions, and that sovereignty, once challenged by force, must be answered in kind or not at all. Episode 2, 1807 to 1830, Federalism, Fear, and the Question of Who's Actually in Charge. To understand why the Insurrection Act exists at all, one has to bear in mind that early America was not especially confident about the answer to a very basic question. Who exactly is in charge here? The Constitution created a federal government, but it did so delicately, nervously even, like a man juggling nitroglycerin next to a blast furnace while insisting that he's got everything perfectly under control. The states retained an enormous power. Local militias were assumed to be the first line of defense against disorder. The federal government was meant to be strong enough to survive, but weak enough not to frighten anyone. And this worked, right up until it didn't. The problem was not tyranny from above. The problem was paralysis from below. What happens when a state cannot enforce the law? Just as importantly, what happens when it will not? The founders had seen this movie already under the Articles of Confederation, where the national government could issue polite requests and then watch helplessly as states simply ignored them. The Insurrection Act was designed to prevent a return to that same sort of impotence. It does not erase federalism, it merely acknowledges its limitations. The Act assumes correctly that emergencies do not wait for jurisdictional debates to resolve themselves, that mobs do not consult constitutional theory before lighting their torches and burning their effigies, and that a republic which cannot compel obedience to its own laws will not remain a republic for very long. This is why the act is structured as a last resort. The president may intervene only after state authorities are overwhelmed, obstructed, or are actively complicit in the breakdown of civic order. In other words, federal force is not the first move, it is the fine, we are out of options move. From the beginning, the Insurrection Act embodied a hard truth about self-government. Liberty requires order, and order occasionally requires someone to be willing to say, that's enough. Episode 3, 1831 to 1860, Nullification, Abolition, and the Slow Boil Toward Crisis. If the early republic worried that the federal government might be too weak, the decades before the Civil War answered that concern with a very long, very grinding, very arduous stress test. The Insurrection Act did not gather dust. It was invoked, carefully, selectively, as the nation discovered that disorder did not always come in the form of mobs. Sometimes it arrived wearing the cloak of state authority. In 1832, South Carolina attempted to nullify federal law outright, declaring that tariffs passed by Congress were unenforceable within its borders. This was not protest, it was defiance. President Andrew Jackson responded by making something very clear. The Union was not a suggestion. He prepared to use federal force to ensure the law was executed, invoking the same authority embedded in the framework of the Insurrection Act. The crisis diffused before shots were fired, but the precedent was set nonetheless. Federal law was not optional. Elsewhere, disorder took different form. Abolitionist movements clashed violently with pro-slavery factions. Mobs broke into jails. Courts were obstructed. Federal marshals were attacked while attempting to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. A morally repugnant law, to be sure, but a law nonetheless. Here, the Insurrection Act reveals an uncomfortable reality. It is morally neutral. It does not care whether a law is just. It cares whether a law exists and whether the federal government can enforce it. That neutrality is precisely why the act is dangerous and why it is necessary. By the 1850s, the country was coming apart not in one clean rupture, but in 1,000 local refusals to accept shared authority. Kansas bled, Congress brawled, states armed themselves. The Insurrection Act was invoked to suppress violence, to protect federal officers, and to preserve the idea that there was still a United States, even as the substance of that unity eroded bit by bit. By the time the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the act had already done its job about as long as it could. It cannot prevent civil war. It can only delay the moment when the question of sovereignty is answered by gunfire instead of by law. Episode 4, 1861 to 1865, Lincoln, Rebellion, and the Insurrection Act at full throttle. Everything that came before was prologue. If the Insurrection Act was designed for emergency, the Civil War was the nightmare scenario that its authors barely dared to imagine, but quietly prepared for anyway. When Southern states seceded in 1860 and 61, they did not merely protest federal authority, they repudiated it. Courts closed, federal officers were expelled, forts were seized, militias became armies. This was not civil unrest, this was organized rebellion. Abraham Lincoln wasted no time pretending otherwise. Within weeks of taking office, he invoked the Insurrection Act to call up state militias, deploy federal troops, and suppress what the law still insisted on calling insurrection, even as it metastasized into full-scale war. Why the legal fiction? Because admitting that the Confederate States were a separate sovereign nation would have conceded the very point the war was being fought to deny. The Insurrection Act allowed Lincoln to do something crucial, to treat the rebellion as illegal without legitimizing it. It gave him the authority to suspend habeas corpus, to occupy territory, to arrest conspirators, and to enforce federal law where state governments had collapsed or defected. None of this was neat. All of it was controversial. Much of it would be challenged in court for decades afterward. But the alternative was far worse. Without the act, the federal government would have been paralyzed by its own constitutional scruples while armed rebellion dismantled the Union in real time. This is where romantic versions of American liberty tend to start getting squeamish. The truth is less comfortable. Lincoln preserved the Constitution by stretching it nearly to the breaking point. He governed in a space where legality lagged behind necessity and where every decision carried the risk of becoming precedent for abuse. And yet, the Union survived. The Insurrection Act did not win the war. Armies did that. but it made the war legally possible. It supplied the scaffolding that allowed a constitutional government to wage existential conflict without admitting it had ceased to be constitutional at all. When Appomattox arrived, the rebellion was defeated. The insurrection, however, was not. It had merely transmogrified into a different form, and that meant the act was not about to retire. Episode 5, 1870 to 1875, Grant, Reconstruction, and the federal boot on the Klan's neck. If Lincoln stretched the Constitution to save the Union, Ulysses S. Grant used the Insurrection Act to force the Union to still mean something afterward. And this is the part of the story that almost never gets told straight. After the Civil War, the shooting stopped, but the rebellion did not. It simply shed its uniforms and went underground. What emerged in the defeated South was a campaign of organized terror aimed at undoing Reconstruction by any means necessary. Enter the Ku Klux Klan. This was not a loose collection of hayseeds in pillowcases. It was a paramilitary insurgency, coordinated, violent, and explicitly political. Its goal was to overthrow Republican state governments, suppress black voting, and nullify federal authority through intimidation and murder. State governments either could not stop it, or they would not. Grant understood something that many later presidents would prefer to forget. When states abdicate their responsibility, sovereignty does not vanish, it merely defaults upward. Between 1870 and 71, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, explicitly grounding their power within the Insurrection Act. Grant used that authority frequently and aggressively. Federal troops were deployed. Habeas corpus was suspended in parts of South Carolina. Thousands of Klansmen were arrested. The organization was effectively shattered within less than a year. This is the point where modern sensibilities often grow uncomfortable. Federal troops occupying American states, mass arrests, suspended civil liberties. And yet, elections were held, black citizens voted, Republican governments functioned. The rule of law, though imperfect and fragile, reasserted itself. Grant invoked the Insurrection Act more than any other president, and by a very wide margin. Not because he was power hungry, but because Reconstruction was a counterinsurgency campaign masquerading as peacetime governance. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The federal government only succeeded in protecting civil rights when it was willing to enforce them at the point of a bayonet. And when that willingness faded in the mid-1870s, so then did Reconstruction. The lesson is a stark and deeply unfashionable one. Rights unenforced are rights revoked. The Insurrection Act did not betray American liberty in this era. It defended it briefly, incompletely, and at enormous political cost. When federal enforcement ended, local despotisms swiftly rushed back in. Which brings us neatly along to the next phase, when the act is no longer used to suppress rebellion, but to break strikes, disperse mobs, and manage the growing pains of an industrial empire. Episode 6, 1877 to 1921, Labor Wars, Railroads, and the Price of Order. If Reconstruction was the Insurrection Act used to defend constitutional government, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the act used to defend infrastructure. And that distinction is one that matters. America after the Civil War did not merely rebuild, it industrialized at a speed that bordered on psychosis. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel and coal fueled explosive growth, and cities filled with newly arrived workers who discovered, to their surprise, that industrial capitalism was not an especially sentimental thing. When things broke down, they broke down swiftly and rather violently. The opening act was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, triggered by wage cuts during a depression. What began as a labor protest metastasized into mass unrest across multiple states. Rail yards burned, militias collapsed, state governments panicked. President Rutherford B. Hayes invoked the Insurrection Act and sent federal troops into several cities, not to mediate, not to negotiate, but to keep the trains moving. And this sets a durable precedent. The federal government would intervene when disorder threatened national commerce, regardless of whose fault that disorder was. Order first, justice later, possibly never. The pattern repeats itself with the Pullman strike of 1894. Railroad workers walked out, rail traffic stopped, and the mail stopped too. President Grover Cleveland invoked the Insurrection Act over the objections of Illinois' governor and deployed federal troops. Violence followed. Strikers were killed. The strike collapsed. The Supreme Court later upheld Cleveland's actions, affirming a principle that still echoes today. The federal government may use force to ensure the functioning of national systems, even against state resistance. The act had quietly evolved from an emergency tool into a standing guarantee that the machine would keep running. Through the early 20th century, the Insurrection Act hovered in the background of labor conflict like a loaded revolver on the mantelpiece. It wasn't always invoked. Sometimes the mere threat of it was enough. Federal troops were used to suppress riots, guard facilities, and restore order during strikes that overwhelmed local authorities. This was not subtle, nor was it ideologically coherent. The same act that had been used to crush white supremacist terrorism was now being used to break strikes being led by desperate workers. The Constitution did not care why order collapsed, only that it had. The federal government had become the armed middleman between capital and chaos. And here is the key transition. Rebellion was no longer necessary. Disorder alone was sufficient. Which brings us to the next act. When the Insurrection Act is applied not to organized labor or to insurgents, but to cities themselves. Episode 7, 1957 to 1963, Desegregation and the Return of Federal Force. If the Insurrection Act had spent decades as a blunt instrument of industrial order, the mid-20th century marked its moral transition and its public rehabilitation. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used the National Guard to block black students from entering Little Rock Central High School, openly defying federal court orders. President Dwight Eisenhower responded by invoking the Insurrection Act, federalizing the Arkansas National Guard, and sending in the 101st Airborne Division. This was not in any way subtle. This was the United States Army escorting teenagers to class, and the signal was unmistakable. State resistance to constitutional rights would be treated as insurrectionist disorder. For the first time since Reconstruction, the act was used not to suppress reform, but to enforce it. The pattern repeated in 1962 at the University of Mississippi, where riots broke out over James Meredith's enrollment. President Kennedy invoked the act. Federal marshals and troops restored order. In 1963, Governor George Wallace staged his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. Kennedy again invoked the act, although Wallace folded before troops were required. The lesson was now institutionalized. The states could posture all they wanted, but Washington would ultimately prevail. Episode 8, 1964 to 68, Civil Rights, Riots, and the Federal Referee. And then came the riots. From 1964 through 68, American cities erupted following civil rights flashpoints and later the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Entire neighborhoods burned, local police forces collapsed or withdrew. Presidents Johnson and later Nixon invoked the Insurrection Act repeatedly to deploy federal troops and National Guard units into major cities. This was no longer about segregation alone. It was about the federal government acting as a national fire brigade. The act had completed a full ideological circuit at this point. Reconstruction, enforcing civil order, labor era, enforcing economic order, civil rights era, enforcing constitutional order, and finally riot control, enforcing public order. Same statute, different moral valence, identical legal authority. And once again, precedent hardened. Episode 9, 1989 to 1992, From Panama to Los Angeles. By the late 20th century, the Insurrection Act had become less controversial and perhaps more ominous. Los Angeles, 1992. After the Rodney King verdict, Los Angeles descended into mass unrest. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. The California National Guard proved insufficient. President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act and deployed federal troops. The intervention worked. Order was restored, but the optics were different now. Televised urban warfare made Americans newly aware of what federal force inside the country actually looked like. The act was no longer abstract history. It was helicopters, Humvees, and soldiers on city streets. Episode 10, 2005 to the present, Katrina, Chaos, and the Modern Anxiety. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina introduced a new anxiety. What if disorder wasn't political at all? In New Orleans, law enforcement collapsed entirely. Looting, violence, and abandonment followed. President George W. Bush considered invoking the Insurrection Act to federalize response efforts. He ultimately did not, but Congress amended the act shortly thereafter to broaden presidential authority during natural disasters. That expansion was so sweeping, it frightened governors across the political spectrum, and it was partially rolled back in 2008. Still, the Rubicon had been approached. The act was no longer just about rebellion, it was about failure. In the 21st century, the Insurrection Act exists as a constitutional emergency lever no one wants pulled, but which no one is willing to remove. It has been discussed during protests, riots, pandemics, and political unrest. It remains invoked sparingly, but referenced constantly. Its power lies less in its use than in its availability. The act endures because it answers a question no society can avoid forever. What happens when order collapses and no one else can restore it? The answer for over 2 centuries has been the same. The federal government steps in. Not because it wants to, but because eventually someone must. Epilogue: the Insurrection Act and the problem no republic escapes. The Insurrection Act endures for a simple reason. No republic can survive on consent alone. Consent works until it doesn't. Laws function until they aren't obeyed. Institutions command respect until they don't. At that point, every system confronts the same ancient question: who enforces the rules when the rules stop enforcing themselves? The Insurrection Act is America's answer to that question. Not a comfortable answer, not a pretty one, but a necessary one. It exists because the founders were not romantics. They had lived through rebellion. They understood that liberty without order collapses into faction, and order without authority collapses into chaos. So they built a constitutional emergency brake, one deliberately ugly, deliberately frightening, and deliberately hard to pull. The act does not create tyranny, it presumes it. It assumes that someday, somewhere, civil society will fracture badly enough that force will be required to restore it, and that pretending otherwise is childish. Every invocation of the act has followed the same pattern. Local authority fails. State authority falters or resists. Federal authority intervenes, order is restored, and then everyone argues about it afterward. That argument is not a flaw. It is the system working. The danger is not that the act exists. The danger is forgetting why it exists, or worse, assuming it will never be needed again. History teaches the opposite lesson. The Insurrection Act is not a weapon looking for a target. It is a fire extinguisher sitting behind glass. You don't admire it. You don't celebrate it. You don't pull it out to make a point. But when the building is on fire and no one else can put it out, you'll be very glad it's there. And if that idea makes you uncomfortable, good. A republic that feels entirely safe has already stopped paying attention. And with that, we return the act to its case. We hope that it gathers dust for another generation, and we remind ourselves quietly that order is not automatic, it is enforced. In the present day, without naming names or parties, there are numerous elected officials at the state and local level who would do well to remind themselves that they, and all persons who enter into public office in the United States, voluntarily swore a solemn oath to preserve and defend the Constitution. That means the whole Constitution, even the parts that you don't care for at the moment. The Supremacy Clause contained in Article 6 is not a polite suggestion. It's not a bug in the system. It is the system. It means when you raise your hand and swear that solemn oath, you acknowledge that you are powerless to pick and choose which federal statutes suit your fancy and which ones don't. In other words, this is not a smorgasbord. You don't get to pick what's on the menu. Elsewhere in that solemn oath, you swear to see that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed, and there is no parenthetical clause that says, unless my state passes a law to the contrary. That is not how any of this works. You additionally swear that you are undertaking said oath without mental reservation or purpose of evasion. Why do the Supremacy Clause and the Insurrection Act exist? They exist because, regrettably, they have to. They exist because a hammer has no utility without an arm to swing it. They exist because sometimes men swear solemn oaths whose conditions they have no real intention of living up to. They exist because the alternative to their existence is balkanization, chaos, and anarchy. And here, ladies and gentlemen, ends the field guide. I now transmit you into the frostbitten arms of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we toil in the vineyard of historical perspective so that you can drink the sweet, sweet nectar of erudition. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. So glad you could join us this evening. And yes, you do get intellectual bonus points for watching us instead of some silly sports ball game. Immigration is one of those issues where the public memory seems to reset roughly once every election cycle, as though the United States simply burst into existence in its current demographic configuration sometime during the Carter administration, and any proposed deviation from the present arrangement must therefore be rooted in either malice or ignorance. That assumption is false. America has always had immigration, but America has never had this immigration, not in scale, not in permanence, not in structure, and not in the accompanying insistence that asking questions about it is, in and of itself, an indictment of the questioner's moral character. So tonight, in the enduring interest of the public mental hygiene, we will do what we always endeavor to do on this program: slow down the tape, widen the aperture, and take a look at how immigration has actually worked for most of American history, not as a moral parable, not as an aspirational exercise based on feelings and emotion, but as a guided set of principles, traditionally at least, with limits, pauses, expectations, and consequences. There will be no demonization here, even when it might be warranted. There will be no sanctification here, even when it gives us warm, fuzzy feelings in our tum-tum. What there will be are numbers, norms, verifiable facts about the historical record, and even the occasional uncomfortable comparison that some bleating buffoons who prefer that we never think deeply about matters of great nuance and complexity would prefer that we don't make. So please securely fasten your safety harnesses and keep any dangling appendages inside the vehicle at all times. There are no helicopters and Humvees this week, but there are steamships, quotas, exclusion acts, and at least one moment where nostalgia proves less stupid than modern certainty. Episode 1, 1607 to 1776. Settlement is not immigration. Before we can talk about immigration, we must first dispose of a category error that poisons nearly every modern discussion of this subject. And the error is this: early America was not built by immigrants in the modern sense. It was built by settlers. That distinction is one that matters, and it matters a very great deal. The people who arrived at Jamestown and Plymouth and the other early 17th century colonies were not entering a stable, sovereign nation state with a labor market and a welfare apparatus and a legal identity already in place. They were founding societies from scratch, often badly, sometimes fatally. Your host's own paternal ancestors arrived with the third supply to Jamestown in 1609, a voyage so catastrophic that history remembers the following winter as the starving time. And that starvation was your reward for being lucky enough to be on one of the 7 vessels that actually arrived at the destination, and not the one that got shipwrecked in Bermuda or the one that was lost at sea without a trace. Which is to say, this was not an Ellis Island welcome center. This was try not to die of malnourishment or dysentery while attempting to invent a country. Settlement required total assimilation because there was nothing to be multicultural with. There was one language, one legal system, one political culture, and survival depended on adopting all of it immediately. No one arrived demanding accommodation, no one arrived expecting support, and no one arrived with the option of remaining culturally separate for generations on end. The early colonies were harsh, exclusionary, and unapologetically selective, not out of cruelty, but of necessity. A weak society cannot absorb unlimited difference. If it tries, it collapses. That principle does not vanish with time. It merely becomes unfashionable to mention it. Episode 2, 1776 to 1840. A republic opens the door carefully. After independence, the United States did become a nation capable of receiving immigrants, but it did so cautiously, with an eye toward cohesion rather than sentiment. Early immigration policy was almost aggressively boring. There were no mass intakes, there was no permanent entitlement to entry, and crucially, there was no blanket assumption that everyone who arrived would be allowed to stay, and no one suggested that there ought to be. Naturalization took time, political rights took longer, and the expectation was clear. Newcomers would adopt the language, laws, and civic habits of the Republic, not negotiate with them, not express hostility and contempt toward them, and not sneeringly dismiss them as being inferior to what existed in the place they voluntarily emigrated from to begin with. It's the most basic, most elemental part of the immigration compact, but today it's been almost completely discarded. When you go to a new country, the onus is on you to fit in with the way they do things. To put it in the simplest of metaphorical terms, when you are a guest in someone else's home, you don't get to complain about the interior decor. Immigration levels rose and fell organically over the years, commensurate with the demands of the labor market and the exigencies of economic expansion. When the country needed people, it welcomed them. When it didn't, immigration slowed, sometimes dramatically, sometimes completely. And no one of any political stripe considered this in any way controversial. The idea that a nation might pause immigration to consolidate its population, stabilize wages, or absorb previous arrivals was considered common sense. Not cruelty, not xenophobia, not a moral emergency. Immigration was understood as a privilege extended by a sovereign people, not a human right enforceable against them. This understanding will persist remarkably intact for well over a century. Episode 3, 1840 to 1914, Ellis Island and the Myth of the Open Door. This is the period that is most often invoked and most often wildly misunderstood. Yes, immigration numbers were high. Yes, millions arrived. And yes, America absorbed them because it filtered them. Ellis Island was not a welcome mat, it was a sieve. Between 20% and in some years as many as 50% of arriving passengers were rejected and sent back, often at the steamship company's expense. Why? Because the rules were blunt and they were unapologetic. If you were sick, you didn't get in. If you were disabled, you didn't get in. If you could not plausibly support yourself through labor, you didn't get in. If you became a public charge, you could, and most likely would, be deported. There was no social safety net. There were no entitlement programs. There certainly was no concept of importing entire extended families with the expectation of permanent public support. Immigration was tolerated, even encouraged, precisely because it was conditional. And most crucially of all, assimilation was non-negotiable. Your great-great-grandparents arriving from Norway in the 1880s, as this reporter's maternal great-great-grandparents did not arrive as something called Norwegian Americans. They arrived as Norwegians who were expected immediately to engage themselves in the work of becoming Americans. They understood the expectation, and they abided by it without resentment or complaint. They learned to like the things the Americans liked. Why? Well, do you remember the old saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? There is a reason that axiom has existed for 2.5 millennia, because it's a wise and useful bit of advice. They learned English. They adopted American civic norms. They participated in American institutions. They retained their cultural memory, culinary preferences, old world folk tales, religious predilections, and what have you, but they did so privately, not as a rival identity. That is what the melting pot looks like. We call it the melting pot precisely because it melts. Episode 4, 1882 to 1924, limits, exclusions, and a nation says, that's enough for now. As industrialization accelerated, immigration surged, and with it came social strain, wage pressure, and political backlash. The response was not hysteria, it was legislation. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was ugly, discriminatory, and morally compromised, and it also reflected a broad consensus that immigration policy existed to protect social cohesion and labor stability, not anyone's abstract ideals or emotional peccadillos. The same logic produced literacy tests, health requirements, and eventually national origin quotas, the sort of things over which we've been conditioned to gasp and clutch our pearls in the present day, but which, again, were not remotely controversial in a country where there was common, nearly universal assent to the notion that immigration exists primarily for the benefit of the nation, and whatever benefits redound to individual immigrants and their descendants are a function of them living up to their end of the bargain by being productive, engaged, well-behaving members of the society they have been allowed to join. And here is the key point that the modern discourse often refuses to acknowledge. These policies were bipartisan, they were popular, and they worked. From 1924 onward, immigration dropped sharply, wages rose, assimilation accelerated, ethnic enclaves thinned out, and the country digested what it had already taken in. This was not seen as a betrayal of American values, it was seen correctly as responsible stewardship. No serious person believed immigration should be infinite, no serious person believed assimilation was optional, and no serious person believed demographic transformation was a cost-free proposition. That consensus will hold largely unquestioned until the late 20th century. Episode 5, 1965 to 1985, the Quiet Revolution nobody voted for. And here is where everything changes, and drastically does it change, practically overnight. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act is often falsely portrayed as a moral correction to earlier acts of alleged discrimination. What it actually did was far more consequential and far less openly debated. It abolished national origin quotas, it introduced family reunification as the primary driver of immigration, and perhaps most pertinently of all, it quietly decoupled immigration levels from labor demand, assimilation capacity, and any semblance of historical precedent. At the time, its proponents, and make no mistake, this is what we would call in our current day parlance, a broad bipartisan coalition, assured the public that overall immigration levels would not increase by any significant degree. Needless to say, they were wrong. Spectacularly wrong, in fact. Or alternatively, they were all a bunch of damned liars. What followed was the invention of a brand new societal norm that was never put to voters at the ballot box. Permanent, high-volume, seven-figure immigration every single year, indefinitely. No pauses, no digestion periods, no meaningful assimilation enforcement, and eventually no expectation that newcomers would adopt the dominant culture at all. This was not in any respect the historical American model. It was another thing entirely. It was a top-down social engineering experiment, conducted without public consent and justified retroactively by brute force moral intimidation and public shaming of anyone who was unwise enough to start asking questions about its wisdom and its utility. And once set in motion, it proved very difficult to stop. Episode 6, Melting Pot versus Multiculturalism. Two very different animals. At this point, it becomes necessary to address the distinction that modern discourse does everything in its power to blur beyond recognition. The melting pot and multiculturalism are not synonyms. They are not even adjacent concepts. They are, as a practical matter, opposing social theories. The melting pot is premised on convergence. It assumes a dominant civic culture into which newcomers are expected to integrate, not to erase their past, not to abandon private traditions, not to forfeit cultural memory, but to adopt a shared public identity, because a coherent and cohesive society, in order to be that, demands that they must. Multiculturalism rejects this premise entirely, and proudly does it do so. It says, move to a new country and make no personal concessions whatever. Do not learn the language, do not adopt the norms, do not subordinate your prior identity to the civic culture that you have joined. Instead, import the old country wholesale and expect, even demand, that the host society adapt to you. If and when it declines to do so, start shrieking about racism and xenophobia. The result is not diversity, it is fragmentation. A melting pot produces a coherent culture with internal variation. Multiculturalism produces parallel societies that increasingly view one another with suspicion, resentment, or outright hostility. And here is the crucial historical point. America was not built as a multicultural society. It was built as a pluralistic one, which is a different thing altogether. Pluralism assumes and expects and welcomes and encourages disagreement within a commonly shared framework. Multiculturalism dismantles the framework itself, then pours gasoline on its remains, and then lights them on fire. No nation survives that indefinitely. In fact, if you're looking for the quickest route to societal atomization and the doom spiral toward failed nationhood that invariably accompanies it, you don't need to ask your GPS for directions. Just jump on the multiculturalism highway, and you'll be there before you know it. Episode 7, Chain Migration, the Welfare State, and Perverse Incentives. Now we arrive at a problem our predecessors did not face, because they were serious people and they were wise enough not to create it in the first place. Historically, immigration functioned in a world without a modern welfare state. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. If you couldn't support yourself, you didn't stay. And nothing about that was xenophobic or immoral or remotely objectionable to any sane person with an IQ above room temperature. The idea that nations should import millions of people with no future potential to be anything but public charges just out of some misguided desire to be benevolent and multicultural is not just inadvisable, it's not just stupid, it is stark raving madness. It's the kind of stark raving madness that turns high-functioning societies into failed states. In fact, there's no other possible end result when you start going down that road. The math simply doesn't math, and the numbers do not care about your feelings. If you import hundreds of thousands, even millions, of unproductive, unskilled, non-able-bodied persons year after year after year, your society will fail. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You might be able to delay it somewhat by reducing your native-born population to a condition of ever-increasing penury and destitution, but you cannot permanently forestall a thing that is, by its very nature, unavoidable. The ship is going to hit the iceberg, and it is going to sink. And all the fancy people with all the fancy qualifications and all the fancy degrees will look at each other quizzically and exclaim, "How did this happen?" When immigration was tied to the capacity for self-sufficiency, as it was throughout 80% of American history, it imposed a natural selection pressure that favored the industrious, the adaptable, and the motivated. In other words, precisely the kinds of people that a growing nation wants. Chain migration fundamentally alters that equation, and not in a good way. When immigration policy prioritizes extended family reunification over skills, over labor demand, and over assimilation potential, and combines that with a vast and far too generous social safety net, it severs the connection between immigration and contribution. You are no longer selecting for builders, you are selecting for dependents. This is not a moral judgment about individuals, rather, it is a structural critique of incentives. No system can long endure when it rewards arrival more than integration, presence more than participation, and grievance more than gratitude. The idea that a nation might import millions of people indefinitely, including the elderly, the infirm, and the unskilled, and support them permanently at public expense, would have struck every prior generation of Americans as complete and utter madness, because that's what it is. Episode 8, Where America Fell Short and Ought to Own It. None of this is meant to suggest that America has always succeeded in living up to her own stated ideals where immigration is concerned. In point of fact, she most assuredly has not. Her failures, when they have occurred, have been manifold and decidedly inglorious. Chinese railroad workers did much of the work in building the backbone of the continent and were then excluded from the full participation which some of them had rightly earned. Braceros labored in American fields for decades and were sent home without the opportunities for permanence that some of them most certainly deserved. And most shamefully of all, European Jews, attempting to flee pogroms and persecution in the years preceding and immediately after the outbreak of the Second World War, were turned away with only a precious few high-profile exceptions, and many of them, far too many in fact, were thus consigned to deaths that were so horrifying as to strain the imagination of any human being with a functioning conscience. These were moral failures, to be sure. They deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve never to be downplayed or forgotten. But here is the sleight of hand in which modern pro-mass migration rhetoric attempts to engage. It treats historical injustice as a blank check for permanent policy irrationality. Acknowledging past wrongs does not require us to invent new ones. Rectifying injustice does not oblige us to abandon sovereignty. And compassion is not the same thing as willful institutional self-harm. A nation can be humane and selective at the same time. America once was that type of nation. There is no good reason why it cannot be again. Episode 9, Demographics Without Conspiracy. The elephant in the room, quietly noticed. Now we approach the part of the conversation that makes people very, very nervous indeed. So, while we will proceed with care, we will also call things what they are. Across the United States, the Anglosphere, Europe, and much of the developed world, the same pattern has emerged since the beginning of this century. Native birth rates fall below replacement level. The institution of marriage is devalued and falls into decline. Family formation collapses. Home ownership becomes unattainable for young adults. And mass immigration, accordingly, becomes the sole mechanism of population growth. Whether this outcome is intentional, accidental, or emergent is beside the point. Because irrespective of the cause, the result is the same. It's a result that is not conducive to a flourishing society. It creates a reality that nobody in their right mind should regard as being a good thing. Large-scale demographic replacement does not require a sinister cabal of evil men hatching dastardly schemes in smoke-filled rooms. It requires only incentives, in this case, perverse incentives. And incentives, especially perverse ones, have predictable consequences. To note this reality is not to ascribe motive, nor is it to live in the realm of the tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist. It is merely to observe and acknowledge that a well-documented reality exists. And well-documented realities, rhetorically inconvenient though they may be to certain people who seek to advance certain agendas, do not care about how virtuous anybody feels while ignoring them. Episode 10, What Immigration is For and Who Decides. This brings us to the central question that often lurks, often implied but rarely spoken out loud beneath every argument about immigration. Whom is this for? Is immigration policy meant to benefit migrants themselves? Is it meant to help the balance sheets of big corporations? Is it meant to confer a permanent electoral advantage upon a certain political party? Is it meant to advance a certain set of abstract global ideals? Or is it meant to benefit the nation as a whole, socially, economically, and culturally? It goes without saying that in the present day, in light of the body of evidence we have before us, the latter answer seems vanishingly unlikely to be the correct one. But for the vast majority of American history, it was the correct answer, and it was an answer that was as obvious as it was uncontroversial. Sure, there were always arguments about how many people we should let in, where they should come from, when to have a moratorium, how long it should be, but there was broad agreement across party lines that the primary beneficiaries of immigration policy are supposed to be the people who already live and work in this country. A sovereign people decide who may join them, on what terms, in what numbers, and to what end. They do not do so out of hatred or intolerance, but stewardship, not out of fear, but responsibility. A nation that loses the ability to say enough is not compassionate, it is incoherent and unserious. Epilogue, Immigration and the Obligation to Inherit. America is indeed a nation of immigrants, but more precisely, it is a nation of successfully assimilated immigrants. That success was not accidental. It was structured, it was expected, and it was enforced socially, culturally, and legally. The tragedy of the present moment is not that people want to come here. This has always been true. The tragedy is that we have forgotten what coming here is supposed to mean. A nation is not a hotel. Citizenship is not a subscription service, and identity is not infinitely divisible without consequence. If America is to endure, not merely as an economic zone, but as a people and as a nation, it must recover the courage to say what every functional society has always known. Immigration is not an entitlement. It is not a human right. It is a privilege. The price of the privilege is productivity, assimilation, and good conduct. And sovereignty is non-negotiable. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, well, good. It should make them uncomfortable. Far too many people have spent far too many years living with their heads in the clouds, imagining that residency in the United States is some sort of party favor that we can pass out to anybody in the world who happens to want it. But it is not, and we cannot. So that discomfort, hopefully, is a much needed and long overdue first indication that historical memory and pragmatic rationale are perhaps at last, reasserting themselves. And as we close out this field guide, we would do well to ponder the following questions. What kind of a place do we want to be? Do we want to be a place that's worth living in, or a place where everybody gets to live? We cannot be both. We have to pick one or the other. Do we care about the inheritance that for some of us has been passed down by 14 generations of our forebears? Since Jamestown and Plymouth and Popham and Salem and elsewhere, do we want our own descendants 14 generations hence, in the year 2450 or thereabouts, to have access to that same inheritance? Or are we comfortable sacrificing it on the altar of some naive vision of a borderless globalist utopia that is never going to exist? And most importantly, do we have the right to make that choice at all? Is it our place to break the chain of inheritance that connects our ancestors 420 years ago and our future progeny 420 years from now? And if we choose not to break the chain, what should that inheritance look like? Should it look like a coherent, cohesive nation state that cares about its own historic values and traditions and institutions and expects, unashamedly, without apology or equivocation, that new arrivals should do the same? Or should it just look like a flag and a few scraps of old parchment that we don't pay that much attention to anymore because it's passé and unfashionable? And as those questions hang ominously in the air for your consideration, I thank you once again for your kind attention and convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we persist in our firm belief that curling is not a sport, it's just a thing that happened because Canada didn't have enough bowling alleys. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. So good to have you with us tonight. You know what time it is now? It's that time, once again, when we dispose of yet another category error that tends to fatally poison the quality of the public discourse on an issue of fairly great significance. This particular category error is one that seems to know no particular political dividing lines. It's a misunderstanding that afflicts the vast majority of Anglophone Americans, and it's a uniquely stupid misunderstanding. So tonight, we shall confront it as we always confront things, as only we can, by taking a pleasant, leisurely stroll through the verdant, gently rolling meadow of objective reality, pausing occasionally to take a drink from the stream of historical perspective that runs through it, and carefully avoiding the piles of intellectual dog crap that have caused such regrettably large numbers of us to engage in the foolish, ignorant modes of thought that make monologues like this necessary in the first place. And so tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in the enduring and abiding interest of the public mental hygiene, we present herewith, for your kind consideration, Curmudgeon's Field Guide to White Latinos. Prologue, The Beige Illusion. There is a decidedly peculiar belief that has taken root in the American imagination, a belief so durable and so often unexamined that it now floats through polite conversation like so much scented air freshener. And it goes a little something like this. If a person speaks Spanish and hails from south of the Rio Grande, they must, by definition, be brown. Not might be, not often are, but must be. As though somewhere between Laredo and Lima there exists a giant ultraviolet lamp that gently toasts all European ancestry into a uniform shade of something we might call civic diversity. This is what your host likes to call the beige illusion. It is the comforting but rather wacky assumption that Latino is a skin tone. A crayon in the proverbial 64 pack, if you will. A crayon whose slot sits somewhere between toasted almond and latte with intentions. But here is the problem. Latino is not a race. It is not a color. It's not even a Pantone swatch. And it's not a sunscreen rating. It is a cultural and linguistic inheritance tied to the Iberian Peninsula, a peninsula which, the last time we checked, remains stubbornly attached to Europe. And yet, in our American discourse, we tend to speak as if 600 million people across 2 continents and a scattering of islands share not only a common language, but a common melanin concentration. That is not an exercise in sociology, it is an exercise in paint mixing. And tonight, in the name of intellectual and demographic rigor, we are scraping that paint off of the damn wall. Episode 1, the census form that broke everyone's brain. Let's begin with a document that is so boring it could tranquilize a meth-addicted rhinoceros, namely, the United States Census. On the census form, you are asked 2 separate questions. The first question is this: what is your race? You have one of 6 options. Number 1, white. Number 2, black or African American. Number 3, Asian. Number 4, Native American. Number 5, Pacific Islander. Number 6, other. Then you are asked a completely separate question. Are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Now let's all pause for a moment and take a deep cleansing breath. If Latino were in fact a race, the form would not need 2 questions. The federal government, an institution not widely renowned for subtle metaphysical distinctions, has nonetheless managed to grasp a concept that cable news panels routinely fumble. Hispanic is an ethnicity. White is a racial category, and these are not mutually exclusive concepts. You can be white and Hispanic. You can be black and Hispanic. You can be Asian and Hispanic. You can be indigenous and Hispanic. You can even be confused and Hispanic, which apparently is one of our national pastimes. And yet, every election cycle, and more often still, we hear breathless commentary about something called the Latino vote, as though we are discussing a hive mind that convenes quarterly in order to issue color updates. If your whole mental model collapses when someone checks both white and Latino, that's not them being contradictory, that is you being a dumbass. Episode 2, Iberia is still in Europe, last time we checked. Now let's take a moment to review a bit of 4th grade geography, shall we? Spain is in Europe. Portugal is also in Europe. They have each been in Europe for quite some time, as long as anybody can remember. In fact, they are not honorary Europeans. They are not provisional Europeans. They are not exchange students from the global south. They are simply Europeans. Spanish is a European language. Portuguese is also a European language. These languages did not bubble up spontaneously from the Amazon rainforest like a fashionable new brand of artisanal kombucha. They came across the Atlantic in wooden boats filled with extremely confident Europeans. And when those Europeans settled in the Americas, they did what humans have done for all of history. They reproduced. Now, did they also mix with indigenous populations? Yes, they did. Did they mix with Africans brought through the slave trade? Also, yes. Did Latin America develop complex, layered, and regionally distinct racial hierarchies of its own? Absolutely yes. But here is the part that seems to short-circuit the internal wiring of the American cerebellum. European settlers in Latin America, wait for it, they had European descendants. I know, it's a lot to take in, but we will get through this together. And those descendants did not evaporate. They did not turn sepia upon exposure to equatorial humidity. They did not wake up one morning and say, "My goodness, I appear to have become non-white due to a verb conjugation." They remained what they were, Spaniards and Portuguese descendants, now speaking Spanish or Portuguese in a different hemisphere. If speaking Spanish makes you non-white, then every sophomore who spends a semester abroad in Madrid should prepare for a fairly dramatic transformation. Duolingo is a powerful thing, but alas, it is not alchemy. Episode 3, Argentina, or How an Italian Restaurant Became a Country. If Americans knew anything, really anything at all about Argentina, half of this confusion would quickly evaporate. Argentina is, demographically speaking, what happens when Europe misplaces its car keys and finds them in South America. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Argentina actively encouraged European immigration. Millions of emigres duly arrived, especially Italians and Spaniards. Entire shiploads of Europeans disembarked in Buenos Aires and decided, yes, I think this will do quite nicely. Today, a very substantial majority of Argentines have predominantly European ancestry. Take a walk through Buenos Aires and you will see architecture that looks suspiciously Parisian. Step into a cafe and you will hear an accent that sounds like Italian and Spanish had a very charismatic love child. In fact, linguists have long noted that Rio Platense Spanish, the dialect around Buenos Aires, carries distinctly Italian intonation patterns because so many immigrants came from Naples and Genoa, which means, accordingly, that there are millions of people in Argentina who look Southern European, eat like Southern Europeans, gesture like Southern Europeans, descend from Southern Europeans. But because they speak Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, an American HR department will sometimes look at them and confidently declare, ah yes, a person of color. If your diversity training collapses at the sight of a suspiciously non-melanated Argentine with a name like Federico Rossi, that is not Federico's fault. It is geography's fault, and history's fault, and indeed your fault for not giving a shit about geography or history. Episode 4, the German town with better Wi-Fi than you. Now let's talk about the Germans, because there are a lot of those. Southern Brazil alone has many millions of citizens of German descent. Entire towns, places like Blumenau, Joinville, Novo Hamburgo, and others, were founded by German settlers in the 19th century during those heady halcyon days after the close of the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans declared, now that there is actually a nation-state called Germany for the first time ever, it is time for us to establish our own colonial empire so we can start feeling a bit less inferior to the British and the French and the Spaniards. In Chile, there are well-documented waves of German immigration beginning even before German unification, all the way back to the 1850s, which means it would be more strictly correct to call it Prussian immigration and Bavarian immigration and Saxon immigration, but the host digresses. The point being, you had lots of ethnically German emigres who established lots of German schools, German churches, German newspapers, and all manner of other German institutions. To this day, there are Chileans with surnames like Schneider, Muller, and Schrader who speak flawless Chilean Spanish and can also make a hell of a good strudel. They are not cosplay Europeans. They are the descendants of Europeans, and they grew up speaking Spanish. And when one of them lands at LAX, sunburned from Santiago, passport in hand, and someone mentally files him under the heading of brown-skinned minority, there is a bit of a metaphysical glitch in the American matrix. It is possible, stay with me here, for a man named Hans to order a plate of empanadas. It is possible for a woman named Ingrid to speak rapid-fire Caribbean Spanish. It is even possible for someone to be both Lutheran and Latino without the universe imploding. Language is not a pigment. Accent is not a melanin supplement. And Duolingo does not perform race reassignment surgeries. Episode 5, the Confederates who wouldn't go quietly. And now, because history has a sense of humor far darker even than my own, we arrive at the Confederates. After the American Civil War, thousands of former Confederates left the United States rather than living under Reconstruction. Many of them settled in Brazil, particularly in Sao Paulo state. There is still a town called Americana, founded by these very same emigres. Their descendants, sometimes called Confederados even today, still hold cultural festivals. They still trace their lineage back to the American South. In fact, if you want to go to a place where the descendants of Confederate soldiers still proudly wave the stars and bars and unashamedly celebrate the history and culture of the antebellum American South, but you won't find it anywhere in the former Confederacy, but you will find it if you go to Brazil. And if that's not the single most ironic thing in this whole monologue, I don't know what the hell is. Now, just try to imagine explaining that to a descendant of a Confederate colonel, a guy who's now 6 generations deep in Brazil speaking Portuguese, farming his soybeans, that he is not white because he is Latino. I myself would pay a not inconsiderable sum of money to watch that conversation take place, and I suspect I am probably not alone in that inclination. History is a messy thing. Identity has many layers. Sometimes those layers are not as conveniently adjacent to one another as our broad-based, low-information assumptions would prefer that they be. And the Americas were not settled by a monochrome committee. From Spanish aristocrats in Lima to Basque ranchers in Uruguay, from Italian dockworkers in Buenos Aires to German settlers in Chile and Brazil, the Western Hemisphere is a kaleidoscope of European diasporas layered atop indigenous civilizations and African legacies. The result is not a single shade, it is a spectrum. And pretending otherwise may be emotionally convenient, but it is intellectually unserious. And on this program, we do not traffic in intellectual unseriousness. That, after all, is what Twitter is for. Episode 6, Cuba and the racial hierarchy Americans forgot. Let us now don our life vest and sail 90 miles south of Florida for a headlong collision with that cruel mistress named reality. For centuries, many centuries in fact, Cuba operated under a very clear and unambiguous racial hierarchy. A ruling elite class descended from white Europeans, a large population of enslaved Africans and their descendants, and a complex, multifaceted caste structure in between. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't theoretical, it was plantation economics. By the late colonial period, Cuba had one of the largest enslaved African populations in the Americas, which is a fun thing to mention to your woke leftist friend the next time he assures you that chattel slavery was some sort of uniquely American enterprise. At the same time, Cuba also had a powerful white landowning class of Spanish descent that ran the island's politics and its economy. Fast forward to the 20th century, pre-revolutionary Cuba had prominent white political families, white industrial elites, white professionals, white everything. After the revolution, a significant number of those white Cubans fled the island, mainly to Florida, which is how you end up with a political reality in Miami, where some of the most hawkish anti-communist voices in America are Latino voices, and they are white and Spanish-speaking. The idea that Latino equals non-white collapses instantaneously the moment you look at Cuba's history for more than about 12 seconds. In fact, Cuba alone should have ended this confusion, but nevertheless, here we are. Episode 7, Race versus Ethnicity, the category error that ate cable news. Now we must perform a brief public service announcement. Race and ethnicity are not synonyms. Race in modern American discourse is largely about physical ancestry markers, skin tone, facial features, etc. Ethnicity refers to one's cultural identity, language, heritage, traditions, historical origins. Latino is an ethnicity. It describes people who are connected to Latin American cultures. It does not describe a skin color. You can be any number of things: white and Latino, black and Latino, indigenous and Latino, mixed and Latino. You can even be East Asian and Latino, a fact to which around 200,000 Japanese Peruvians will readily attest. If this feels shocking, that's because American racial thinking tends to operate on a simplified binary model inherited from its own history. The United States had a very particular racial structure that was shaped largely by slavery and segregation. And when you're operating in a simplistically ethnocentric headspace, as Americans have a regrettable tendency to do, it is tempting to project that template onto the entire Western Hemisphere. But the Western Hemisphere did not sign up for America's PowerPoint presentation. Latin America developed mostly under Iberian colonial systems with different racial classifications, different social hierarchies, and different intermarriage patterns. Trying to compress all of those factors into the color brown is not progressive, it's just lazy. It's the intellectual equivalent of labeling every European French, which, needless to say, wouldn't go over very well with the Germans. Episode 8, the mythical creature known as the Latino vote. And now we arrive at one of my favorite American cultural hallucinations, the Latino vote. Every election cycle, pundits gather around a glowing map and whisper reverently about it, saying things like, "The Latino vote is shifting. The Latino vote is energized. The Latino vote is disappointed." As though they're discussing a singular hive mind organism that meets annually in Phoenix to decide what its current feelings are. There are Mexican Americans in Texas whose families have been in North America since before Texas was even Texas. There are Cuban Americans in Florida whose worldview was shaped largely by Cold War exile politics. There are Venezuelan immigrants in Doral who have strong opinions about socialism and not the academic kind. There are Puerto Ricans in New York whose political calculus differs wildly from Salvadorans in Los Angeles. Some are conservative Catholics, some are secular progressives, some are evangelical Protestants, some are business owners, some are union members, and a great many of them look very different from one another. The assumption that a pale Argentine banker, a dark-skinned Dominican teacher, and a third-generation Mexican-American oil field worker will move in electoral lockstep because they share a linguistic heritage is ambitious at best and a shockingly offensive stereotype at worst. Americans would never speak about something called the European vote. Why? Because we understand that Swedes, Greeks, and Poles are not the same thing. But say Latino, and suddenly nuance packs its bags and quietly egresses the building. Episode 9, How America Exported Its Racial Framework. Now here is where things get interesting. The United States developed a very particular racial architecture shaped by British colonial law and the one-drop rule and various segregation statutes and a black-white binary that dominated public life in certain parts of the country for centuries. That framework makes sense, historically, inside of the American story. The problem begins when Americans assume it is the default operating system for the entire hemisphere, for it is not. Spanish and Portuguese colonial societies developed very elaborate, sometimes nigh impenetrable caste systems. Peninsulares, criollos, mestizos, mulattoes, messy, hierarchical, inconsistent, but very starkly different from the American binary. Intermarriage was more common. Racial categories were often more fluid. Social status could often hinge on class, language, and proximity to power as much as on skin tone. When modern Americans try to interpret Latin America using strictly American racial categories, it's like trying to run European voltage through an American appliance. There will be sparks. Sometimes there will be smoke. And occasionally, a graduate thesis that probably ought not to have been published. The irony is a rather delicious one. In attempting to be culturally sensitive, Americans sometimes flatten entire societies into caricature. We accuse others of oversimplifying race, and then we oversimplify race internationally. That is not enlightenment. That is provincialism with slightly better branding. Episode 10, Why This Misunderstanding Actually Matters. Now, someone in the chat is probably going to say, come on, Cap, who really cares? Isn't this just all semantics? To which the host retorts, no, it is not. It matters for at least 3 reasons. First, policy. If lawmakers and institutions operate under crude assumptions about identity, they craft crude policy. You cannot build intelligent outreach, education, or immigration policy when such policy predicates itself on demographic fantasy. Second, political analysis. If pundits assume uniformity where none exists, they will be repeatedly shocked by election results and then blame the voters for not behaving properly. Third, and this one is personal, is dignity. People deserve to be understood as they are, not as a projection of someone else's cultural template. Telling a white Chilean of German descent that he is non-white because he speaks Spanish is not progressive solidarity. It is a misunderstanding wearing a name tag. And misunderstandings, when repeated often enough, harden into dogma. Dogma then becomes policy. Policy becomes reality. And suddenly, a category error has real consequences. If you're serious about diversity, you must first be serious about accuracy. Otherwise, you're just rearranging stereotypes and calling it moral progress. Epilogue, Curmudgeon's Field Guide for a Perplexed Republic. So here, dear viewer, is the TLDR version of your field guide. If someone speaks Spanish, do not assume their skin tone. Do not assume their ancestry. Do not assume their politics. Do not assume they vote as part of a synchronized hive organism. Ask questions. Learn history. Resist the urge to compress 500 years of hemispheric complexity into a drop-down menu. The Americas are vast. They are layered. They are complicated. And that complexity is not a bug. It is the story. If you wish to reduce it to a single earth tone for the sake of rhetorical convenience, you are not correcting prejudice. You are merely inventing a new prejudice. On this program, we believe in facts. We believe in history. We believe in irritating everyone equally. And above all, we believe that hemispheres do not come with Cliff's Notes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much indeed for your kind attention. And I now convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where defeating Canada isn't just a fun leisure activity, it's a way of life. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all Zambonis at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. Delighted to have you with us tonight. And yes, full disclosure, I didn't watch any of the Olympics this year. In fact, I haven't watched the Olympics in a good number of years, since the Olympics, like nearly all sporting competitions, have been utterly ruined by the imposition of dumb political activist bullshit. But, having said that, when the gold medal game in hockey is the USA versus Canada, I will make a one-time exception for that. And I'm glad I did, because today, on the 46th anniversary of the Lake Placid Miracle on Ice, the Americans defeated Kazakhstan 2-1 in overtime for our third ever gold medal in hockey. I guess we have to say men's hockey now, but whatever. Why do they have to play 3-on-3 overtime in the gold medal game? I can't say, but it sucks. And it's stupid. How did it happen that the host nation built a hockey rink that doesn't resemble the dimensions of a regulation hockey rink anywhere in the world, and without anybody noticing until it was far too late? Again, I can't say, but it sucks. And it's stupid. But setting those complaints aside, it's a pretty fantastic game. And though I no longer give two squirts of piss about the Olympics, I am glad we won. Now, in the United States, for the average American, this is going to be a thing that provides maybe a couple days of enjoyment and good feelings and is then quickly forgotten about. But in Canada, this is going to be recorded as one of the blackest days in their history. Not their sporting history, mind you, but their national history. Does that make this victory even more gratifying? Yes. Yes, it does. But we're not here to talk about hockey tonight. We're actually here to talk about something much sexier and more exciting: tariffs. Now, as you have most assuredly already heard by now, 2 days ago, the Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 decision in which the majority held that President Donald Trump exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law that was passed by Democrat majorities in both houses of Congress and then signed into law by a Democrat president, in which Congress invested the chief executive with the authority to, at his own discretion, identify and declare economic emergencies related to international commerce, and to take whatever remedial measures he deems appropriate, including the imposition of tariffs and other associated duties. But since Trump is the president now, the Washington establishment doesn't necessarily believe the things it believed 49 years ago. And if there's anything we know about the Washington establishment, it is that Chief Justice John Roberts is one of its very favorite sons. And if there's anything we know about John Roberts, it's that he hates Donald Trump with the white-hot, burning intensity of 1,000 suns. Roberts has been looking for an opportunity to get into a dick-measuring contest with Trump and thus assert the continuing supremacy of the Washington establishment by kneecapping some major aspect of his second-term agenda, and I guess he thinks that he has found it here. The legal rationale isn't much to write home about, really. The majority opinion, authored by Roberts himself, makes the rather fanciful argument that Trump needed to go back to Congress and ask them to confirm, on a case-by-case basis, the authority that the 1977 Congress already exclusively invested in the president. Will this decision make a whole lot of difference as a practical matter? Not really. Because, as Justice Brett Kavanaugh correctly noted in his dissenting opinion, there are 3 or 4 other statutory avenues whereby Trump can continue levying the exact same tariffs he has already been levying, and if the Supreme Court wants to neuter all of those, that will take many years to accomplish. And let's go ahead and ask the question that functions as the rhetorical elephant in the room. If Congress doesn't like the way the president is executing one of its statutes, shouldn't they handle it by repealing or rewriting or revising the piece of legislation in question? In a sane world, yes, but alas, we don't live in a sane world, and so here we are. As we know all too well, since this is a thing that involves Donald Trump, the current conversation around tariffs tends to take the form of a zero-sum game. If you're a fan of Trump, then tariffs are great and awesome and wonderful, but if you're a member of Team Orange Man Bad, if your idea of sartorial tastefulness is wearing a pussy hat with a keffiyeh, then tariffs are evil and autocratic and completely intolerable. This has the predictable result of turning a conversation about a subject of great nuance and complexity and its historical scope into your typical online flame war where 2 opposing camps of low-information morons just scream abusive epithets at one another. But here on this program, we don't play that game. Here on this program, we believe the 30,000-foot historical view is the view that matters most. Why? Because all events in the present day are a culmination of a long series of previous events that transpired in years and decades and centuries past. And current-day arguments that fail to take historical perspective into account are, ultimately, exercises in stupidity and ignorance. So tonight, in the enduring, undying interest of correcting category errors and promoting the public mental hygiene, we present for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to Tariffs. Prologue, the price tag with a flag on it. If you think a tariff is something China pays us for misbehaving, then we need to have a talk. A calm talk, a friendly talk, a talk involving a bit of arithmetic, because somewhere along the way, we as a people developed the charming belief that when Congress places a tariff on imported goods, foreign governments gather in smoky rooms, pass a hat around, and mail us a check with a little note attached to it that says, "Oh, we're sorry about everything," but that is not actually how any of this works. A tariff is not a fine levied against a misbehaving nation. It is not a diplomatic parking ticket. It is not a patriotic surcharge paid by foreigners as some sort of penance. It is, strictly speaking, a tax. Specifically, it is a tax imposed by the United States government on goods entering the United States. If you're wondering who writes the check, the answer is the importer does. The American company that brings the goods through the port. The man standing at the dock, not the man standing in Beijing. The law determines who writes the check, but the market determines who feels the bruise. Now, before anyone starts polishing their pitchforks or fainting into a chaise lounge, let me be clear. Tariffs are not inherently wicked. They are not inherently virtuous. They are tools. Blunt tools. Tools that can raise revenue. Tools that can protect domestic industries. Tools that can distort markets. Tools that can change behavior. But tools nonetheless. And like most other types of tools, they can be prudentially and responsibly used, or they can be used recklessly and destructively, depending on whose hands happen to be holding them at any given moment. And before we argue about whether to swing the hammer, we might want to first start by understanding what a hammer is. Because for roughly about 60% of our national history, tariffs were not some exotic economic side dish. They were the entree. They were how the federal government kept its lights on. For most of American history, the federal government was essentially a customs house with its own navy. There was no income tax, there was no IRS, there was no annual ritual of self-loathing in April each year. There were just ships, ledgers, and dockside receipts. If that surprises you, good. That means we are already learning something. Chapter 1. What a tariff actually is. First, let us define the thing before we weaponize it. I know that's an unfashionable thing to do in a world where nearly all discourse takes the form of an internet flame war, but bear with the host nonetheless. A tariff is a tax imposed on imported goods, not on exporters, not on foreign governments, but on imports. When a shipment of steel or automobiles or washing machines or novelty lawn flamingos arrives at an American port, the importing company pays a tax calculated as a percentage of the value of those goods. That tax becomes part of the cost structure. Now, here is where people start tripping over themselves, typically. Some will say, well, sure, technically the importer pays it, but the forward producer always absorbs the cost. Well, not always, but sometimes. Others will say, no, the consumer always pays it. Not always, but sometimes. Still others will say, domestic producers always benefit. Again, not always, but sometimes. In other words, welcome to Economic Policy 101, where things are never as simple as your perpetually doom-scrolling brain and your entomological attention span would prefer them to be. Who ultimately bears the cost of a tariff depends on supply chains, on competition, on price sensitivity, and on the relative bargaining power of buyers and sellers. It depends on how easily consumers can switch to alternatives. It depends also on just how desperate foreign producers are to maintain their market access. But one thing it does not depend on is patriotic chanting. The tariff is collected at the border by our government from our importer. That is the starting point. Everything else is market dynamics. And once we understand that, we can start asking better questions. Not does China pay, but what happens next? Chapter 2, Before the IRS, How We Ran the Country on Dock Fees. Now let's rewind the tape for a moment and take a nice long drink of historical circumspection. From 1789 until the early 20th century, tariffs were the primary source of federal revenue, not a side hustle, but the main event. The Constitution itself gave the Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And in the early Republic, duties, meaning tariffs, did most of the heavy lifting. Why was that? Because the federal government was small, really quite small, in fact. There was no sprawling administrative state, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was no assistant deputy undersecretary in the Department of Alphabet Soup. The federal government built a navy, maintained a few post roads, serviced war debts, and kept the republic stitched together rather loosely, and that was about it. If your government fits inside a shoebox, then dock fees will cover the rent nicely. And this is where things start to get interesting, because tariffs were not merely fiscal instruments, they were political explosives. In 1832, South Carolina decided it didn't much care for a federal tariff law that it considered unfair, so the state legislature passed what was called the Ordinance of Nullification, in which it declared that the tariff was going to be void within its borders. And now you've got a problem, because if a state can simply opt out of federal law, you no longer have a federal government. You have something closer to a suggestion box. Yes, the first shot of the Civil War was fired in South Carolina, but it was not fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. It was fired nearly a full 3 decades earlier when a state declared that it could unilaterally nullify a federal tariff. Before the cannons, before the uniforms, the fight began with a customs schedule. President Andrew Jackson did not find this very charming, but then that was the same reaction he had to most things. He threatened force. Congress duly passed what became known as the Force Bill. You may recall this story from the Insurrection Act episode of 3 weeks ago, because said act was very nearly invoked in this case, but ultimately, the crisis was de-escalated, as sometimes tends to happen when you point bayonets at people and ask them how much they really want to go to federal prison. But the principle was nonetheless established, and it was a principle that said tariffs are not just economic policy, they are constitutional stress tests. They forced the country to confront a question that would not stay buried. Is the Union supreme, or is it optional? That is not a minor footnote. That is a tectonic signature on the civilizational Richter scale. Chapter 3, Protection versus Revenue, Pick a Lane. In the early Republic, tariffs were primarily about revenue. Ships come in, goods get taxed, the government gets funded. It's clean, it's simple, it's a nice little balance sheet on a ledger, but as the 19th century progressed, something else crept in. Protection. A revenue tariff is designed to raise money. A protective tariff, on the other hand, is designed to raise prices on foreign goods high enough that domestic producers can compete more easily or indeed dominate outright. And here's the part that almost nobody says out loud. The higher you raise a tariff for protective purposes, the less revenue it may generate. Because if you tax imports heavily enough to discourage them, fewer imports arrive. Fewer imports means fewer taxable transactions, which means lower revenue. You can fund a government with tariffs, or you can wall off foreign competition with tariffs, but doing both at maximum intensity is a mathematically awkward proposition. This tension ran through the 19th century like a live wire. Industrial states in the North often favored higher protective tariffs. Agricultural exporting states in the South, which depended on exporting raw materials to foreign markets and on importing finished goods, often despised them. Tariffs weren't just fiscal policy, they were sectional policy. And once again, we find ourselves back at the edge of constitutional argument and political fracture. Because when you use tariffs to rearrange the industrial geography of a nation, you are not just collecting money, you are picking winners. Chapter 4, the 16th Amendment changes the plumbing. And now, inevitably, we arrive at 1913. The 16th Amendment is ratified. Congress is granted clear constitutional authority to levy a federal income tax. Parenthetically, if you ever find yourself getting the impression that many of the worst choices we have ever made as a society happened during the Woodrow Wilson administration, that is not any sort of an accident. And overnight, well, not strictly overnight, but close enough to overnight for our present narrative purposes, the plumbing changes. The federal government is no longer primarily funded by what crosses the docks. It is funded by what crosses your paycheck. And this changes everything. When tariffs were the main revenue source, there was a natural ceiling. You could only tax as much as the ships brought in. You were necessarily constrained by trade volume. But once income taxation becomes central, then constraints shift, and they shift rather wildly. Revenue becomes tied to domestic productivity and earnings, not just to imported goods. This allows the federal government to expand dramatically, exponentially in scope over the course of the 20th century. Foreign wars, social programs, regulatory regimes, all of it required a revenue stream far larger than dock fees could ever hope to sustain. And this is where modern nostalgia sometimes wanders into fantasy. Yes, but we used to run the country without an income tax. Obviously, this is a true statement. We also used to run the country without interstate highways, aircraft carriers the size of small cities, Medicare, or a standing administrative state larger than the national population was on the day the Constitution was ratified. You can fund a minimalist republic on tariffs. You cannot fund a $4 trillion federal apparatus on cargo ships without consequences. Scale matters. And arithmetic remains undefeated. Chapter 5, National Security is not a coupon code. Now let's fast forward to the modern era. Tariffs reemerge not primarily as revenue engines, but as strategic tools. Congress has, over time, delegated significant authority to the executive branch to impose tariffs under certain conditions, including national security. And this is where rhetoric becomes elastic. Because who's doing the interpreting, the term national security can mean any number of things. It can mean critical defense materials, supply chain resilience, strategic industries, or occasionally, this industry is politically sensitive. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but modern statutory frameworks allow presidents to act with considerable discretion and latitude, which means tariffs are not just economic levers. They are separation of powers levers. And whenever executive authority expands in the realm of trade, you're not just arguing about steel or semiconductors. You're arguing about constitutional architecture again. And this argument is not a new one. It is just a new chapter in a much more venerable argument about how power flows in a federal system. Chapter 6, the Georgia-built revelation. Now let's address the thing that almost everyone misses in this discussion. The purpose of a tariff is not always to collect money, and it is not always to permanently block imports. Oftentimes, the desired outcome is behavioral change. Imagine that you're a foreign automaker. The United States imposes a not insignificant tariff on imported vehicles. You have the following options: absorb the cost and reduce your profit margin, raise prices and risk losing market share, or move production inside the tariff wall. Option 3 is frequently the entire point. If you want to sell into the American market without paying the tariff, well, you can build your factory here. You can hire American workers. You can source your components domestically. You can produce inside the boundary. And suddenly the tariff disappears because the product is no longer an import. The goal was not punishment, the goal was relocation. That is why your brand new Japanese car might have been assembled in Georgia. It's why foreign steel companies invest in American mills. The tariff is, in part, a sign on the door that reads, if you want to sell here, maybe you might consider living here. Now, does that gambit always work? No, of course it doesn't. Does it always produce efficient outcomes? Again, no, it doesn't. But when it works as intended, it doesn't reduce trade to zero. It changes where trade happens. That is a far subtler distinction than most cable news panels and hyperventilating podcast bros have time for. Chapter 7, Smoot-Hawley, or How to Start a Trade War Without Firing a Shot. Now, no discussion of tariffs escapes the gravitational pull of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised U.S. tariffs on thousands of imported goods during the early stages of the Great Depression. And in popular memory, it has become the economic equivalent of lighting a cigarette at a gasoline refinery. The simplified story goes something like this. Congress raised tariffs, other countries retaliated, global trade collapsed, the Great Depression got worse. There is, to be sure, a kernel of truth in that argument. Other nations did respond with retaliatory tariffs. International trade did contract sharply in the early 1930s, but let's resist the temptation to reduce history to a cartoon. The Depression was already well underway before Smoot-Hawley ever passed. Banking failures, monetary contraction, and structural weaknesses were already doing considerable damage. Smoot-Hawley did not single-handedly cause the Great Depression. What it did do was pour sand into an already seizing gearbox. When global demand is collapsing and you raise barriers to trade, that doesn't create resilience, it creates rigidity. And when everyone retaliates at once, that doesn't have the effect of protecting domestic industry, it just shrinks the pie. This is the cautionary tale. Not that tariffs are evil, but rather tariffs deployed into a collapsing global economy can amplify contraction. Tools, context, timing. Swinging a hammer during an earthquake does indeed have consequences. Chapter 8, the thing everyone pretends won't happen. Tariffs are unilateral. Trade is not. If the United States raises tariffs on another country's exports, that country has political incentives of its own. Domestic producers over there demand protection. Politicians respond. Retaliatory tariffs are not exotic, they are predictable. And retaliation does not have to match product for product. If we tariff steel, another country might tariff soybeans. Now, you're not just arguing about industrial policy, you are reshuffling pain across regions and across industries. One sector gains insulation while another sector gains ulcers. This is why trade policy is never just about economics, it is about coalition management. Every tariff creates beneficiaries, losers, and a lobbying cycle that never ends. Once imposed, tariffs develop constituencies. Industries that benefit from the protection rarely volunteer for exposure afterward, which means tariffs can be politically sticky even when their original justification has faded. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Trade wars are rarely declared. Rather, they are products of accretion, a measure, then a response, then a countermeasure, until suddenly everyone is holding fewer customers and issuing more press releases. Chapter 9. Could tariffs replace the income tax? Spoiler alert, no. This is the part where nostalgia takes a deep breath and then leaps off the bridge. Once again, it is tempting to say, well, yeah, but we funded the federal government with tariffs for most of our history. Why can't we just do that again? It is a question with a one-word answer. Scale. The modern federal government spends trillions of dollars annually. To replace the federal income tax entirely with tariffs, you would need to either astronomically raise tariff rates or massively increase import volume, or you would need to reduce the federal government to 19th century proportions, which wouldn't be a bad thing, don't get the host wrong, but option 3 would require a political revolution. Options 1 and 2 collide with arithmetic and behavior. Raise tariff rates high enough to replace income tax revenue, and you drastically reduce import volume, which then shrinks the taxable base. If tariffs successfully suppress imports, then revenue falls. If imports remain high enough to fund the government, domestic producers face continued foreign competition, undermining the protective goal, and the math refuses to cooperate because it just doesn't math. Remember the earlier tension. Revenue tariffs and protective tariffs tend to pull in different directions. You can fund a small republic on dock fees alone. You cannot fund a modern welfare regulatory national security superstructure just by levying tariffs on container ships alone, without either crushing consumer prices or crushing trade volume, or doing both. This is not an ideological sentiment. It is a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets, unlike politicians, do not clap or applause lines. The fact of the matter is, today's U.S. central government has more employees than the population of Panama. In 1789, one of every 13,000 Americans worked for the federal government. Today, one of 85 Americans does. Would it be great if there was a convenient way to pull down that whole rotten edifice and return the central government to being something more modest and more reasonable? Yes, that would be great. But we are here to deal with objective reality, not to eat pie in the sky. Chapter 10, Tariffs are Tools, not Theology. At this point, the camps are usually dug in and fully entrenched. On the one side, you have the people saying tariffs are patriotic, they defend the homeland. On the other, you've got the people saying tariffs are ignorant, they sabotage prosperity. Both of these positions suffer from the same disease, and it is the disease of absolutism. A tariff is not a moral statement, it is not a loyalty oath, it is not an act of xenophobia, nor is it an act of enlightenment. It is just a policy instrument. Like any instrument, it can be used strategically, used clumsily, used temporarily, used permanently, used as leverage, or used as political theater. Sometimes tariffs successfully nurture emerging industries. Sometimes they entrench inefficient ones. Sometimes they encourage foreign producers to relocate inside of the tariff wall. Sometimes they invite retaliation that harms exporters. Sometimes they raise revenue efficiently. Sometimes they quietly become a consumption tax borne by domestic buyers. The question is never, are tariffs good? The question is, what problem are we trying to solve, and is this the right tool for solving it? If you treat tariffs as sacred doctrine, you stop measuring outcomes. If you treat tariffs as forbidden heresy, you stop examining context. Either way, you've replaced economics with catechism, and policy is a poor place for religion. Epilogue: the Customs House and the Constitution. Tariffs have financed the federal government. They have nearly fractured the union. They have protected industries, and they have provoked retaliation. They have reshaped supply chains. They have been wielded by Congress. They have been delegated to presidents. They have funded a minimalist republic and been sidelined by a modern superstate. And through it all, they have remained what they always were: taxes at the border. Not magic, not treason, not salvation, and not doom. Just a lever. A lever that moves capital. A lever that moves prices. A lever that sometimes moves politics more than markets. If you want fewer tariffs, argue from math. If you want more tariffs, argue from incentives. But if you argue as though they are mystical forces that either punish foreigners or guarantee prosperity, you are not doing economics. You are doing mythology. And mythology, for all of its charms, does not balance a budget. And with that, we now close the book on this week's Field Guide. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, ever so much for your kind attention. Please see your nearest serving wench for assistance in settling your tavern tab. And I now convey you into the loving custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.